The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author. I don't know if you've been seeing on FloridaBeerBlog.com, but we are posting again. Yay! Finally doing some posting, which is good. So we're going to be in Bonita Springs for a little bit, which is nice. As we are recording this, they have their Bonita Brew Fest at Riverside Park, not too far from the Gulf of Mexico, coming up, and we will be there. And one of the breweries that is going to be there, and hopefully that you have heard of or saw if you went, is today's brewery. This is Chubby Mermaid, the newest in Bonita Springs. If you are familiar with the area, obviously you come off 75 and there's Bonita Beach Road. If you were to take a right to head to Ceremony and Riverside Park and Hopsized, instead you take a left. And on the other side of the street from where the dog track used to be is a brand new, gorgeous, gorgeous industrial park. And that is the home of Gary Fortin and Josh Hoover's amazing new brewery. And yes, we will go over what a Chubby Mermaid is, but it's pretty simple. If you've taken a look at the logo, you kind of know what one of those is. So we're going to speak to both of them. They are not Florida natives, which makes their story all the more interesting as to why they chose not only Florida in general, but Bonita Springs in particular. We'll talk a little bit about their homebrewing days and how that sort of dovetailed into social media, which is a distinctly modern way of doing things. It's kind of interesting. And more, getting everything open and building their facility from scratch. So here we are, Gary Fortin, Josh Hoover, Chubby Mermaid Brewing in Bonita Springs. Enjoy. So I will start off with backgrounds because you come from a military background. Is that correct?
That's Gary, actually.
Gary, you come from a military background, but you also come from a healthcare background. And I find it interesting that both of those, military and healthcare, are very strongly represented in craft beer. Why do you suppose that is?
Wow, that's a good question. I didn't even know that was a thing. I thought that we were unique in that respect.
Believe it or not, there's a lot of people that had or have medical backgrounds. And then obviously it's very easy to go up and down the coast, especially on the Atlantic coast, and look at some that not only use their military background, but are very proud and have that as a part of their corporate name and culture and so on.
Got it. Okay, you're focusing kind of on the military side of it.
Let's start with military.
Yeah, I think with military, it's if you get into this craft as a military person, you may have this wish or goal to open a brewery someday, but it's not really feasible because you could easily be deployed, PCS to another location, and then you wouldn't have a brewery anymore, and that investment would be gone. And it's not really a portable kind of situation unless you're really gotten big and you have the financial backing to expand or grow to another location. But then there's still the logistics of trying to run 2 breweries or 3 breweries and from afar. So I think the military people, when they either get out or they retire, they feel safe at that point that they can, dip their toe in the water of, should I do this? Yeah, I think that's...
And then you take a look at medical, like, as far as I'm concerned, the most famous medical professional-owned brewery in the state is Barrel of Monks. And they've parlayed so much of that experience into some of the operations they have. Where do you think that comes in usually.
I always say that nursing was, for me, the medical field and nursing was what funded my life and what funded my passion. So I think in the medical profession, there's probably a little more ability to maybe squirrel away enough money to probably make this happen. And I think that's why you might see more medical professionals do that. And then the second part of that is that medical burnout is real. And so it's one of those things, at least in my case, I was to the point of, okay, do I go get my nurse practitioner or do I open a brewery? So it's like
radically different.
Right. So it's like, do I go back to school at my age or do I open a brewery at my age? So that was the choice.
And then you have your what is interesting, but your where is almost mind-blowing as to where you got into craft beer, because you were living in
San Diego County.
And I love Florida. It's got a lot of great craft beer scenes, but is it going to touch San Diego County, the entire state? Right. I mean,
I tell a lot of our customers that this region of Southwest Florida, and I haven't done a whole lot of exploring outside of even north of Charlotte County, let's say, but this section feels like, I started with saying 10 to 15 years ago, San Diego County, but that's not even true. It feels like 20 plus years ago, San Diego County. There's, again, just to beat a dead horse, and our customers hear this from me all the time, we are the fourth brewery in all of Bonita. There's nothing in Estero. There's 3, maybe 4, I think now Naples total, because Riptide had 2 locations, and then their second location went to Kaleidoscope. Yeah. And so it's like, you're telling me there's 7 breweries in all 3 of these cities, in this, Lee and Collier County area? That's insane. Like, there's 7 breweries in my neighborhood back home that I can walk to. So
is that, do you credit that with being a lot of how you got into your craft beer interest, in just being
absolutely there? The first beers I got into were, Stone Arrogant Bastard. Once you get past, once you realize that you're not a PBR drinker, or, you drink cheap Steel Reserve from the gas station or something like that, and you want to get into something that has a little more flavor, at the time, Stone was fully embracing the arrogant, brash, bastard, mantra that they had, a yellow beer is for wussies, slogan that they had. And Arrogant Bastard was what got me into, craft beer.
And then where were you stationed that you started to sort of get into craft beer? I talk about our field producer all the time. When he was in the Navy, he was stationed in Boston and did a lot of red brick lager. A little too much, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, for me, it was an epiphany of probably not necessity, but lack of the yellow fizzy stuff. I was in New England, and we were at a party, and I brought Bud Light, whatever, 6-pack, and I was drinking that, and we were having a good time, and time was going on, and I ran out of my beer. So I looked in the fridge. There was no more Bud Light, but there was some Sam Adams, of all things, right? So I was like, okay, hey, who's got the Sam Adams? And I do. Can I have one? Yeah, go right ahead. So I drank it. The first of that beer was probably a little hard to palate for me at the time. And then slowly it was, okay, wait, this is not too bad. And then a little while later, somebody came with a 6-pack not a 6-pack, but a suitcase of Bud Light. And it was like, I brought the Bud Light. I'm like, I think I'll stick to this. And that was it. Now that was, and then, the necessity of wanting to know how to do that at home and make my own beer. And that's really where it was born.
And what's interesting is that's how you got started with your home brewing, doing stuff in there. Obviously, you probably got your start doing home brewing because it's just what you do in San Diego.
Correct,
apparently. Yeah. And while I usually don't talk about home brewing on the podcast, that's how you two connected. You're on opposite ends of the country because you're here in Florida, you're in San Diego County. Very different. You hadn't really met in person, but you have met in person. Okay, please give me the story.
Go ahead, Josh. I was going to say, I didn't just leap into homebrewing on a whim. It was, I had an uncle and cousins up in Hillsboro, Oregon, near Portland, who they started getting into homebrewing. And they started putting themselves on camera and putting that on YouTube. And so I started actually watching my uncle first.
As they're live homebrewing?
Absolutely. Live or pre-recorded.
Video blogging.
Sure, yeah. And it was hilarious because they would be burning themselves on the stove or making mistakes or spilling something or whatever it was. And I thought it was great. And I was like, well, that sounds like fun. I was at a point in my life where I was switching off of being a rum and Coke drinker, and I started getting into beer. And I go, this is probably if I'm going to be into alcohol and, I need a hobby other than like golf or bowling or whatever, like this is a pretty good hobby, to have. So I got into it watching them. And so that's how I got into watching YouTube videos on brewing beer and then talking to people that you meet whose videos you watch other than my uncle's, Gary being one of them, a whole plethora of guys back in the day, a group that Gary coined the phrase for us. It was called brew tubing or brew tubers.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
So there's an actual brew club called Brew Tubers now that's been going on since 2011. We way before COVID, and when COVID hit, we were really poised to be able to handle, the shutdowns and everything else, because we were already managing this thing online, doing video brew days where we all had our cameras and we were on Hoover back then.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's it.
So yeah, if you just search up Brew Tubers, you'll see it with a circular gray logo and a bright green hop.
They're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. I mean, there's if you search Brew Tubers on YouTube, you're going to come up with dozens, hundreds of channels of people who have had channels in the past or current channels. And then I think they're also on MeWe on top of Facebook and Instagram, maybe a Twitter too. So
yeah, I don't know if they're doing that part anymore.
Clearly not on TikTok right now.
No, not on TikTok.
Tells you when this was recorded.
Yeah. Right. But anyway, yeah, like if you Google brew tubers, a dozen things would come up. Hopefully the website comes up first, but you'll also see all the YouTube videos, and you might even see some of my old videos on there and some of Josh's old videos. And that's how we met. We just commented, and all of us began commenting on each other's videos. And so then we became brew tubers loosely. And then we would meet up in places like Philly or the Pacific Northwest, and whoever could afford to go there, we would all rent a hotel, and we would just hit all the breweries in the area as a group. And so Josh and I met that way on several occasions.
That's amazing, but there's a big jump from that to where we are today.
Oh, yeah.
How did that conversation get started? Because not only are you, obviously all the things that you need to do to operate a business, but you moved across the country to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for my side of things, Gary had been trying to court me for years, and I didn't really pick up on it. I was a little dense at the time. I was still in the midst of my property management career, if you call it, or that chapter of my life. So I wasn't even thinking about doing a brewery, period, end of story. Gary was more poised at the time to start looking into it more seriously, going to conferences and whatnot.
Yeah, I was going to a lot of the conferences, the professional conferences, the NanoCon, and some of those things, and talking to, pro brewers as much as I could. And every now and then I would throw a hint to Josh, or if we were collaborating on something online. I was like, hey, man, you want to open a brewery someday? He's like, yeah, someday I think I'd like to open a brewery in Hawaii or whatever. And he's like, I'm like, okay, well, someday is not now, but, maybe I'm a little bit more ready to open a brewery than he is. So I was like, I didn't push this subject at that time.
And at the time you were living in Pennsylvania.
Correct. And I was going to open a brewery in Pennsylvania, but the vibe wasn't right. So
where in Pennsylvania?
In York County. Yeah.
Okay. So neither of you were here in Southwest Florida.
No. I was still in the military at the time, though. So I hadn't had my terminal assignment yet. So I wasn't really sure where I would end up. So I actually ended up in Augusta, Georgia for my last assignment. So I was fortunate enough to be able to go back and forth because it's not really that far. So we decided to live here. And yeah.
I was going to say, because we sort of mentioned, Bonita, you are just the fourth brewery for two guys that really love craft beer, and you're used to living in places where it's a little bit more saturated than the market is down here. Why did you decide to come down here to open? Why didn't you go to another place, or even, Tampa, St. Pete, Jacksonville, someplace here in Florida that has a little bit more?
The story as I know it is Gary and his wife came down to check out Florida as a good place to retire from the Army eventually, someplace warm. And I believe you guys were on the west coast of Florida. Sorry, the east coast of Florida.
East, yeah.
And Gary, in so many words, said, nah, let's go home, basically, is what I remember. And his wife encouraged him, well, let's go check out the west side. And he was resistant, I think. And ultimately, she, I think she won that conversation, and they came over to preview.
Yeah. So I was a little ignorant of the distance. I hadn't really paid attention to it because we were thinking more Fort Lauderdale, that side, in that area. And when I was looking around, it didn't really appeal to me being a boy growing up in Maine, with vast spaces and houses on top of each other and whatnot. So, and anyway, without getting too much into it, I didn't like the feel of it. So she said, well, let's go check out Naples. And I said, I'm not driving 3 hours to just look at houses. She goes, what do you mean 3 hours? It says it's only an hour and a half. So we drove over. Ish. So she was right. It was pretty quick, actually. I don't know if it was just conversation on the way or what, but she had actually started calling some real estate offices as we were driving, and we ended up partnering up with a real estate agent that day, and we continued to look over here. And I had a pretty specific guidelines, not to bore you, but I wanted my own property, and so he was able to find something out in the estates. So that's where we settled. But South Florida was my goal because I had already started doing market research, and it was very underserved compared to all the other places I had lived in the Army and my life. And of course, Josh can echo this. He's lived in a very densely populated brewery scene, and this place is well underserved. Although the locals will tell you, oh my gosh, there's so many breweries here, but it's like, if you've traveled, you'll realize that there are not.
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to say, South Florida is definitely underserved. Yeah. Southwest Florida makes South Florida look like San Diego.
Yeah.
But it's not to say that it's not getting there.
No, it's sure.
It's good. It's moving. It's moving. Yeah. At least we're moving in the right direction.
Sure. The quality of beers here in Southwest Florida, in my opinion, in the 8 years I've been here, have gone up considerably. It's like everybody's up in their game. So, good stuff.
And I feel that a large part of that is the culture finally kind of connected, and people have been able to go to those places. And it's been interesting, and I'll ask you about this a little bit later. It seems like the original slate of breweries came in with the boring fizzy yellow liquid. As they managed to grab people in slowly but surely, hey, try this. Let's start pushing a little bit harder. Eventually got there.
Sure.
So I guess, did you get him over here from the West Coast before you opened, or did you decide, here's the business, I just need a partner?
So that's how it started. So I started researching. I was going to try to pull it off on my own, but on a much smaller scale, sort of how Bonehook started. Smaller system, whatever. So when I started researching it, it was very little money difference between what we have now and the smaller system. So decided to go with the bigger system, and which required a bigger space. So then it was either I start looking at the local homebrew clubs here and see who's a very good brewer and who has got the financial wherewithal to pull this off with me and the time, or I could ask Josh one more time. It'd be more direct. So I basically said, hey, man, you ready to open a brewery? Or I can't remember. I'm paraphrasing now, but.
Yeah, well, it was basically, honestly, I had kind of forgotten where he moved to. After I lost track of him after Pennsylvania, and he's like, I'm in Florida. I'm like, well, I've never been to Florida. And my wife and I used to take, road trips all the time, camping and whatnot, but we would always commit to like somewhere, a vacation where you fly to every year. And so we had always talked about going to somewhere in the Caribbean. I go, all right, well, we don't normally like to do the tourist trap thing, but let's go be complete tourists in the Bahamas for 4 days, and then we'll come over to Florida for 4 days and check out Florida, because I've never even landed in an airport in Florida on a layover, like never been inside the state boundaries. So I chose middle of summer because it's just a great time to go to a Caribbean island, and also wanted to come here at the hottest, worst time of the year to see if I could tolerate it.
Yeah, great. You chose right.
So we got here, and Gary had already picked out 4 or 5 different commercial spaces, varying prices, varying sizes and all of that, and just varying degrees of new construction, non-existent slab, what we're sitting in right now, and the old, probably 4 or 5 decade old pink stucco strip malls where you've just got hopes and dreams crushed there year after year, and how many businesses have rolled through this place.
Yeah, the skeletons of old businesses.
Yeah, and another criteria was it had to have the right electrical hookup in here already existing, or in new construction's case, they could bring it in. They don't have to switch something out, which can be very expensive. So, any case, during that tour, we were also looking at real estate rentals, something to buy. I mean, we, financial wherewithal. We're pretty responsible people, my wife and I. We don't have kids. We didn't have a mortgage. And so we're like, okay, if we're going to make this leap, where do we want to live? What does the area look like? And so during one of those days where we drove for 6, 7, 8 hours in a day each day, we were coming down, I think, from Bonita, Fort Myers area. And you took us down through Old 41 through Riverside Park. And for me, going down through Riverside Park kind of sealed the deal because we were on the way to our location where we are now. And it just felt like, not old-timey, but small town, clean.
There's a classic Florida sort of feel,
Beautiful.
especially with Wonder Gardens there. It's this kind of, this is what you used to see in the 40s and 30s.
Sure.
That uber non-theme park tourism.
Sure. And it was pre-Ian, too, when we came out. It was end of July 2022, and Ian rolled in September. So everything, there was no trash. There's no graffiti. There's no cigarette butts and needles on the ground like back home. And so for me, that sealed the deal mentally on Bonita. And of the 5 locations that Gary showed me, price-wise, power-wise, build, everything, I was pretty set on it. Gary still had to make the decision because I hadn't agreed to come over yet. But I put in my 2 cents and said, hey, this one out of all 5 is probably a better location. And ultimately, you ended up doing that before I came out.
Yeah. Well, I signed the lease on a render because we were just standing on the concrete pad.
Yeah, there was nothing here.
There was nothing. It was just a concrete pad. The blocks hadn't even been delivered. The developer, our landlord now, he just had a render in his hand. He said, "Oh, this is what it's going to look like." And I said, "Okay, well, can I have that corner unit? Does anybody have that yet?" And he goes, "Nope, nobody's signed yet." And I said, "Okay, we'll take the corner unit." And Josh hadn't really committed to it yet, so I was kind of taking a gamble because had he not, I would have been scrambling to find somebody because this was too much of a project for one person. It still is.
Absolutely. But getting in that early, you were able to sort of make this exactly what you wanted it to be.
Correct. The only thing that would have been better had they had not poured the pad yet, and then we could have put all the plumbing in. That we had to cut up the flooring after they had just poured it, you know what I mean, just to put our plumbing in, which was an added expense for us of, about $38,000?
Something like that,
Yeah, I mean, it's just that. And we hadn't even had the walls yet, and we're spending that kind of money, you know what I'm saying? After already ordering the equipment, it had to be built and then shipped here and whatnot. But
And since this is a new development, how were the owners / your current landlords receptive to the fact that you were going to be opening up a brewery, almost sort of a brew pub concept because you do serve food here?
He sold the whole building on the concept of us being here.
yeah, he courted me like a new girl. Yeah, I mean, he wanted us here badly.
Good, because you see that is becoming a major story of, because you are now an anchor. And there's a lot of places here that I was kind of surprised weren't open right now, but you are open. And You've got a relatively full tap room for a non-peak time right now.
Correct.
I mean, there's football on, but it's
Sure.
This might be our typical Sunday. Not around the holidays. It was a little slower then, but I mean, this is what we were seeing in November on a Sunday. So, right? Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, I was just having a thought that, with all the seasonal change that, the population influx down here, I mean, you kind of live and die by that population influx, but the craft beer scene, I think, has probably benefited from the people who are coming from established craft beer scenes that want the same awesome beer that they have in, let's say, Cincinnati or New Jersey or San Diego or wherever they're, migrating down here from. I was just thinking back to the previous conversation where we were talking about, the original beer scene here may not have been what it is today, but over time, as the population grows and more people are coming down here, they're trying to seek out that thing that they had at their, up north or Midwest home. And maybe some people like you are coming down here. More people are coming down here to retire, and maybe they're going to start opening more breweries to replace the beer that they used to have that they may not have down here currently. That'll help grow the scene too.
That does seem to be sort of a common theme with a lot of industries. You move
Sure.
someplace and you open what you remember.
And so there we are with part 1 of our episode with them. We will be back in a week or so with part 2 opening the brewery and how it's been in Southwest Florida. In the meantime, if you are not doing so, please follow us on social media. We are at Florida Beer Blog on Instagram and Threads. We are FL Beer Blog on Facebook, and we are still working on Blue Sky. I'm going to try and get us back on there as soon as I can. I think Mastodon is also another big place to go, so I'll have to check them out. We're always on the internet. Can't kick us off the internet. We are floridabeerblog.com or floridabeerpodcast.com. And if you need to reach out to us via email, you can do so at floridabeerblog@gmail.com, or you can always message us on Instagram. We do that as well. When you go to floridabeerpodcast.com, you will find that we are a very proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, an amazing group of awesome podcasts based here in the Sunshine State. And you can listen to that and more at floridapodcastnetwork.com. We are available on pretty much every single podcasting app you can think of: Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, YouTube, iHeart. You can even ask your smart speaker to play the latest episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, and it will do so quite happily. If your podcasting app allows you to subscribe, please make sure to subscribe to us. And if it allows you to leave a review, give us a nice 5-star review. It kind of helps us get the word out. That would be greatly appreciated. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Pekala. Executive producer for the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. This is David Butler, your host and author. We will be back next week for part 2 with Chubby Mermaid Brewing. Thank you so much for listening, and drink Florida craft.